His breath was at her ear, no, touching, just there, close enough that the warmth of it moved against the side of her neck, close enough that the fine hair at her temple stirred, close enough that every rational thought she had organized for this meeting dissolved quietly, completely, like sugar in warm water. She did not move. The city blazed 42 floors below. Rain had begun its soft percussion against the floor-to-ceiling glass. The blueprint was still spread across the table in front of her, edges weighted with crystal paperweights that caught the ambient light and scattered it in small rainbows across the polished surface. None of that had changed. Everything had changed. His hand reached past her, unhurried, certain to steady a photograph that was sliding toward the edge of the glass table, and for 4 seconds, just 4, the back of his hand pressed against her knuckles, warm still, present. Her lungs forgot their instructions. She was a professional. She had stood in rooms full of powerful men and never flinched. She had negotiated impossible contracts at midnight. She had talked anxious brides off emotional ledges at dawn. She had built love stories out of nothing but instinct and intention and the precise understanding of how light should fall across a room to make people feel something they would remember forever. She did not rattle. She was rattling. He stepped back first. The movement was smooth, unhurried, as if nothing had shifted, as if the room had not just rearranged itself around 4 seconds of contact and the specific warmth of his breath at her neck. The floral direction, he said. His voice was low, measured, a voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. Tell me your instinct. She pressed her fingertips together beneath the table. A collecting of herself, a private ritual she had developed years ago for moments when composure required conscious effort. She turned slowly. He was standing 3 feet away, dark suit perfectly tailored, hands clasped behind his back, watching her with eyes that were patient and focused and terrifyingly present. The kind of attention that makes you feel every word you are about to say has already been considered before you speak it. White ranunculus, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. No, roses are a performance. She sounds like a woman who has no interest in performing. Something moved in his expression, barely a shift, like light changing in a deep room. Yes, he said quietly. She is not, Marin nodded, made a note on the tablet in front of her, told herself the warmth spreading up her forearm was simply the temperature of the room, the heating system, the glass trapping the last of the afternoon sun. She had been telling herself variations of this for 3 weeks now. She was becoming a very unconvincing liar. If those first lines already did something to your chest, if you are already leaning forward wondering who this woman is and why this man seems to know things about his bride that feel strangely specific, I need you to pause for just 3 seconds. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, share it tonight with someone who deserves a love story that reaches somewhere real. This community exists because of you, and what is coming, what is waiting in the next few minutes of this story will be worth every second you give it. No, let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what happened in that penthouse, to understand why her hands trembled when his brushed against them, to understand the weight of what was about to be revealed, you need to understand who these 2 people were before the universe decided to make them collide. Dominic Ashford Mercer had built his first company at 24 with borrowed capital and a complete refusal to acknowledge the possibility of failure. It was not confidence. Confidence implies the consideration of alternatives. Dominic simply did not build architecture in his mind for outcomes that included losing. The space where doubt might have lived was occupied instead by calculation, by strategy, by the relentless forward motion of a man who had learned early that the world gave you nothing and took everything unless you made yourself impossible to ignore. By 38, his name appeared in financial publications, less as a person and more as a force of nature, something inevitable, something that arrived without asking permission and reshaped whatever landscape it touched. Colleagues used words like calculated, like surgical, like unstoppable. Competitors used words like ruthless, like cold, like the kind of man you did not want across the table from you unless you had already accepted you were going to lose. What no colleague, no competitor, no journalist had ever been close enough to discover was the greenhouse. It occupied the entire eastern wing of his private estate, glass walls rising 2 stories. Climate control systems that maintained precise humidity and temperature for 17 varieties of orchid that required the kind of patient, attentive care that had nothing to do with profit margins or quarterly projections. He tended it himself. Early mornings, before the sun finished rising, before the world demanded the version of him that sat in boardrooms and made decisions that affected thousands of lives, he would walk the gravel path to the glass doors, step inside where the air was warm and thick and alive, and he would work, his hands in the soil, the smell of growth, the particular satisfaction of watching something bloom slowly because you gave it exactly what it needed and then stepped back and let it become itself. There was an honesty in that process he had never found anywhere else. The world outside those glass walls required armor. It required the careful management of expression, of information, of vulnerability. Every interaction was a negotiation. Every relationship existed within a framework of what each party wanted from the other. Inside the greenhouse, none of that applied. The orchids did not care about his net worth. They did not calculate his usefulness. They simply grew or did not grow based on whether he understood what they needed and provided it consistently. He found that simplicity almost unbearably beautiful. He kept letters, too, in a wooden box on the shelf in his private study, away from the offices and the staff and the endless parade of people who wanted something from him. His grandmother's letters, handwritten on paper that had yellowed with decades, documenting 70 years of a marriage that had survived economic collapse and war and the death of a child and the slow erosion of health that comes for everyone eventually. He read them sometimes late at night, in the quiet that arrived only after midnight, when even the city outside seemed to exhale, trying to understand, trying to comprehend how 2 people managed to choose each other over and over again, across decades, how the choosing did not become obligation, how the familiarity did not become boredom, how the love that started as fire somehow transformed into something steadier and no less warm. He wanted that. He had wanted it for as long as he could remember wanting anything beyond the basic architecture of success, but he had never found anyone he could imagine choosing that way, never found anyone who made him feel seen rather than assessed, never found anyone who looked at him and saw the man in the greenhouse instead of the name in the headlines. Until 14 months ago, until a charity auction on a Tuesday evening in November, until a woman fixing flowers in the corner of a crowded room. It had been one of those events where the wealthy gathered to outbid each other for art they did not need while congratulating themselves on their generosity. The kind of evening Dominic attended out of obligation, positioned himself at the back with a glass of wine he was not drinking, and counted the minutes until he could leave without offending anyone important. The room was full of people performing their best selves, women in designer gowns making sure the right people saw them, men in tailored suits discussing deals in voices just loud enough to be overheard. The performance exhausted him. He was calculating his exit when he saw her. She was near the entrance, adjusting a floral arrangement that had clearly been placed by someone else. No, dramatically. No, for attention. No, in any way that suggested she wanted anyone to notice. She was simply fixing something that was wrong. Her movements were focused and unhurried, her attention so completely on the task that the 100 people moving around her, in sequined dresses and expensive suits, might as well have been furniture. He watched her for 4 full minutes before he realized he had stopped breathing normally. She was not the most beautiful woman in the room. That was not what caught him. There were women here who had been professionally designed to be looked at, whose beauty was a carefully assembled product of effort and investment and strategic presentation. She was something else entirely. She was real. When she finished and looked up, her eyes moved across the room without searching for validation or checking to see who might be watching, and then her gaze found his almost accidentally and held no calculation in that look, no quick assessment of his net worth, no recalibration of her expression based on recognizing who he was. She looked at him the way you look at a person, just a person. Something cracked open in his chest. Quietly, completely, he crossed the room. He introduced himself. She did not flutter. She did not perform the kind of impressed response he had grown accustomed to receiving. She simply nodded and said her name, Marin Calloway, and then gestured slightly at the flowers behind her. They were in the wrong quadrant, she said, as if that explained everything. It was making the entire arrangement feel structurally dishonest. He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that arrived before he could manage it, the kind he had not heard from his own throat in longer than he could remember. She smiled briefly, almost reluctantly, and turned back to her work. He stayed for 20 more minutes. They talked about why some events moved people while others merely impressed them, about the loneliness of standing in crowded rooms and feeling completely unmet by everyone in them, about the difference between being looked at and being seen. She disagreed with him once directly, without softening it to protect his ego. He lost his train of thought entirely. When she excused herself to check on something in another room, he stood there among the wealthy and the performing and the strategically positioned, and he felt the specific sensation of the ground shifting beneath his feet. He drove home that night. He pulled into the underground garage of his building, and he sat in his car for 11 minutes doing absolutely nothing, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into his bones with a certainty that left no room for negotiation. He was in love. He understood this with the same quiet clarity he brought to financial analysis. It was not comfortable, it was not convenient. It was not anything he had planned for or would have chosen if choice had been available. It was simply true. The problem arrived immediately afterward. Every approach available to a man in his position felt wrong. He could send flowers to her office, but that felt like acquisition, like something a man with resources did to signal interest, which was really just another form of leverage. He could arrange a dinner invitation on his letterhead, but she had already shown him in 20 minutes that she saw through the performance of wealth, that she valued honesty over impression, substance over signal. He could approach her directly, simply, as a man interested in a woman, but underneath that option lived the deeper fear, the one he kept in a locked room even from himself, the one that whispered in the dark hours when sleep would not come and the penthouse felt too large and the silence had edges. What if he came to her as just a man, nothing else, no empire, no armor, no net worth or influence or name that opened doors, just the version of himself who tended orchids at dawn and read his grandmother's love letters and played violin badly in empty rooms because no one had ever taught him, but he wanted to learn anyway. What if he showed her that man, the real one, the one beneath all the architecture, and it was not enough? What if she looked at him, really looked, without the distraction of his success or his wealth or his carefully constructed public identity? And she did not choose him. The fear was not rational. He knew this. He had built an empire on the foundation of taking risks that terrified lesser men. But this was different. This was not business. This was not strategy. This was not a negotiation where the worst outcome was simply a loss of money or market position. This was the possibility of offering his actual self to another person and being told no. The vulnerability of that terrified him in ways no boardroom ever had. He spent 3 months of occasional encounters at events where they both happened to be present. 3 months of conversations that were never long enough and always left him wanting more. 3 months of watching her from across rooms and feeling the specific ache of wanting something you are afraid to reach for. And then, somewhere in the quiet of a Tuesday night, while rain fell against the greenhouse glass and his grandmother's letters sat open on his desk, he thought of something else entirely. Marin Elise Calloway had learned the architecture of love by standing outside it. Her mother had been a romantic, the kind of romantic that burns bright and burns out, the kind that organizes an entire existence around someone else's arrivals and departures, around phone calls that might or might not come, around the devastating hope that this time might be different. Marin had watched. She had been 8 years old the first time she understood that her mother's happiness was not her own, that it lived in the hands of a man who came and went on his own schedule, who called her mother extraordinary with complete sincerity, right up until the moment he needed to be somewhere else. She watched her mother light up when he arrived. She watched her mother dim when he did not. She watched her mother rearrange dinner plans and weekend trips and the entire geography of her emotional life around a man who treated commitment like a suggestion. She watched for years, and somewhere around 16, in the quiet aftermath of another departure, another dimming, another round of waiting for a phone that did not ring, Maren made a decision. She would never wait by windows. She would never organize herself around someone who had not chosen her first fully, without conditions, without escape routes, without the constant underlying threat of departure that had poisoned her mother's happiness. For as long as Maren could remember, she would build love for other people instead. By 33, Maren Elise Calloway had become the name that couples whispered to each other when money was no object and emotion was everything. She was not an event planner. That description missed the point entirely. She was an architect of emotional experience. She read a couple's love story and translated it into light and space and detail. She understood that a wedding was not simply a party with flowers and music and carefully arranged seating. It was a threshold, a declaration, a ceremony of becoming that deserved to be held in an environment so precisely calibrated that guests did not simply witness, they felt. When Maren designed a wedding, people walked into the room and involuntarily pressed a hand to their sternum. They cried before the vows started. They looked at their own partners across the table and remembered why they had chosen each other in the first place. That was her gift, understanding love from the outside with a clarity that people inside it rarely achieved. She understood the rhythms and phases of love, the early intoxication and the deepening trust, and the hard seasons where choosing each other requires actual effort. She understood what couples needed to see reflected back at them on the day they promised forever. She understood all of it. She had simply never expected it to build a door and walk through it toward her. Because that was the other truth about Maren Calloway, the one she did not discuss, the one that lived beneath her professional expertise and her steady voice and her unshakable composure. She had built a wall, a careful, necessary, load-bearing wall between herself and the kind of love she created for others. She stood close to love every day. She helped shape it and celebrate it and translate it into something tangible. She watched couples look at each other with the specific expression of people who had chosen and been chosen completely, and then she drove home alone. She told herself it was safer this way, and it was. The safety was real. The protection was genuine. But there was also, in quiet moments, she did not let herself examine too closely, a particular kind of loneliness that came with standing outside something beautiful and never stepping through. The commission arrived on a Tuesday morning in September. It was waiting in her inbox when she arrived at her office, which was really just a converted loft space with good light and a wall of fabric samples and mood boards from previous projects that clients sometimes walked along like a gallery. Anonymous client, unlimited budget, full creative control. That combination was unusual enough to make her read the brief twice. The groom wished to be personally involved in every decision. That was specified 3 times in the initial document, as if the person who wrote it anticipated resistance and wanted to preempt it. The brief itself used words like intimate and authentic 4 times each. No, in the way clients usually used those words, as general gestures toward an aesthetic they had seen in magazines. These uses were specific, pointed, as if the person writing understood exactly what the words meant and chose them deliberately. And then, at the end of the brief, a phrase that made her set down the document and pick it up and read it again. A love that does not need an audience, just witness. She sat with that phrase for a long time. Something about it moved her in a way she could not fully articulate. Something about the specificity of it, the understanding embedded in those words about the difference between being watched and being seen. She accepted the commission. 3 days later, she drove 40 minutes outside the city to the address provided, a private estate surrounded by gardens that someone clearly tended with attention and care. The gravel crunched beneath her tires as she followed the winding drive. Trees lined the path, their leaves just beginning to turn with the first suggestion of autumn. When she stepped from her car, portfolio held against her chest like armor, she saw him. He was standing on the front steps of the main house, waiting, and she felt the recognition before she understood it, something in her body responding before her mind could catch up, a quickening pulse, a slight hitch in her breathing, the specific sensation of walking toward someone important. "Miss Calloway," he said, His voice was low, unhurried. "Thank you for coming." She knew who he was. Of course she knew. His name appeared in publications. She did not read and headlines. She scrolled past and conversations she overheard at the events she designed. Dominic Ashford Mercer, one of those names that had become less a person and more a category. But standing in front of him now, watching the way the afternoon light fell across his face, she did not see a category. She saw a man. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was steady, professional, controlled. "I was not aware this was your project." "It is," he said simply, and then he gestured toward the door. "Shall we begin?" The weeks that followed were unlike anything in her professional experience. He was present for nearly every session. No, intrusively. No, hovering over her shoulder or questioning her decisions or performing the kind of nervous involvement that some grooms brought to the process. His presence was different. It was more like gravity than intrusion, grounded, unhurried. An attentiveness she felt before she could explain it, the specific sensation of being in a room with someone who was paying attention, real attention, the kind that most people were too distracted or too self-absorbed or too busy performing their own importance to actually provide. He asked questions about the bride that were too specific. He described her with a precision and a tenderness that began slowly, persistently, to unsettle something Maren had thought was settled. "She does not like luxury when it is meant to impress rather than comfort," he said one afternoon. They were standing beside her mood board, close enough that she was acutely aware of the warmth radiating from his arm. She would rather have something real and imperfect than something flawless and empty. "That is a particular distinction," Maren said, without looking up from the fabric samples. "She makes particular distinctions," he replied. Maren reorganized the samples in front of her. An unnecessary task, a distraction from the awareness that was building in her chest. "What does she look like?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. This was a reasonable professional question. She needed to understand the bride's coloring for the palette selections, her build for the silhouette recommendations, her general aesthetic sensibility for the overall design direction. A pause, brief and full, the way certain silences hold more than words. "Like someone who does not know how remarkable she is," he said quietly. "Which makes her more remarkable." Maren set down the fabric sample, picked up a different one, did not look at him, did not let herself examine why her chest felt tight, or why her hands wanted to tremble, or why the image he was painting of this unnamed woman felt strangely, impossibly personal. "She is fortunate," Maren said. "To be seen so clearly. She is not seen yet," he said. "That is the point of all this." Maren did not ask what he meant. She was afraid of the answer. "We are about to enter 6 weeks that will change both of their lives forever. 6 weeks of moments that seem small but are not. 6 weeks of restraint and tension and the slow, patient accumulation of something that cannot be ignored. If you are invested in where this is going, drop a comment below. Tell me what you think is really happening here. I read every single one, and if you have not subscribed yet, now is the moment. What comes next is worth staying for." The first time he touched her deliberately, it was to give her permission to rest. She had been on her feet for 5 hours straight, reviewing venue photographs, adjusting seating configurations, cross-referencing the guest list against the dietary restrictions and relationship dynamics, and all the invisible factors that determined whether a table would facilitate conversation or catastrophe. She did not notice her own exhaustion. This was normal for her. She had trained herself over years to override the signals of her body when there was work to be done. But he noticed. She was not sure what gave her away. Perhaps a slight shift in her posture, a barely perceptible lean against the table edge, a small adjustment of her weight from one foot to the other. Whatever it was, he saw it, without comment. Without ceremony, he crossed to the corner of the room, retrieved a chair that had been positioned against the wall, and carried it to where she stood. He placed it directly beside her workspace, close enough that she would not have to interrupt her focus to reach it, close enough that the message was clear. "Sit," he said. "No," commanding, certain she sat. They continued working side by side. She reviewed the timeline for the ceremony, while he examined the proposed processional order. They discussed the logistics of guest arrival, and the positioning of the photographer and the timing of the sunset relative to the vows. And at some point she could not identify, his hand came to rest on the back of her chair, no touching her, just present. A warmth at the very edge of her awareness, a specific gravity she felt all the way up her spine, the knowledge that he was there behind her, close enough that she could lean back and make contact if she chose. She did not lean back, but she thought about it. They worked like that for 45 minutes. Neither of them acknowledged it. Neither of them moved. The air in the room felt thicker somehow, charged with something she refused to name. When she finally stood to leave, gathering her materials and organizing them into her portfolio, his hand fell away from the chair naturally, as if it had simply been resting there, as if it meant nothing. She did not look at him. She did not trust herself to look at him. "Same time Thursday," she said, her voice professional and steady and completely at odds with what was happening in her chest. "Same time Thursday," he agreed. She made it to her car before her hands started shaking. The accidental touch came the following week. They were reviewing ribbon samples for the programs, a detail that most grooms had no interest in, that most grooms delegated entirely to the planner or the bride or anyone who was not them. He cared about ribbons, no, in a way that was obsessive or controlling, in a way that suggested every detail mattered, that the ribbon a guest untied to open their program was part of the experience, part of the story, part of the way people would feel when they remembered this day. She reached for a sample at the exact moment he did, the same ribbon silk, the color of winter clouds. Their fingers collided over the table, the pure accident of two people moving toward the same thing simultaneously. He did not pull back immediately, neither did she. 3 seconds. She counted them. Each one distinct, each one weighted with something she refused to examine. And then, so slowly she might have imagined it, his thumb moved once across her knuckle. She looked up. He was already looking at her. His expression was controlled, but something beneath it was not. Something in his eyes that looked like hunger, very carefully restrained. "Sorry," he said quietly. He removed his hand. The absence of his warmth was a specific, identifiable loss, a sensation she catalogued automatically, and then firmly refused to think about for the rest of the session. She thought about it for the rest of the evening. She thought about it while she drove home. She thought about it while she unlocked her apartment and set down her keys and stood in her kitchen deciding she was not hungry, even though she had not eaten since breakfast. She thought about the way his thumb had moved, the deliberate slowness of it, the way he had looked at her with that specific combination of want and restraint that she had seen on grooms looking at brides, but never, not once in all her years of doing this, directed at herself. She was in trouble. She knew she was in trouble. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat in the dark of her living room and had a serious conversation with herself about professionalism and appropriate boundaries and the fundamental danger of developing feelings for a client who was engaged, a client who had hired her to design his wedding to another woman, a client whose touch lingered on her skin like a question she was not supposed to answer. The conversation was thorough, logical, convincing. It did not help at all. The dinner happened in the 5th week. They had been working late, later than professional necessity required, though neither of them said this aloud. The samples and timelines and guest lists had been discussed and decided hours ago. They had moved on to conversation about things that had nothing to do with the wedding. He stood abruptly, said nothing, disappeared into the kitchen. She heard quiet movement, the soft sounds of dishes being arranged, the low hum of something being heated. When he returned, he was carrying 2 plates, simple food, warm, arranged without ceremony, nothing elaborate or performative, just sustenance. He set one in front of her as naturally as if he had been doing it for years, without asking if she was hungry, without making it into anything, without waiting for acknowledgement or thanks or permission. He simply fed her. She was starving. She had not noticed until the smell reached her, her body suddenly aware of hours without food, of energy spent without replenishment, of the basic needs she had overridden in service of work. "You have not eaten," he said. He settled across from her with his own plate, A fact, not a question. I was focused, she said. You are always focused, he said. And something in the way he said it, not critical, not admiring, just known, as if her particular quality of attention was something he had observed and catalogued and quietly held. She felt something in her chest she had no category for. They ate, they talked. No, about the wedding, about real things. He told her about a business decision he had made that year. A choice that had cost him significantly in money and market position. A deal he had walked away from because the other party wanted him to do something he considered unethical. I could have found a way to justify it, he said. His voice was thoughtful. No, self-congratulatory. There are always ways to justify things, but I have to sleep in the same bed as myself every night. And some costs are too high. She told him about a wedding she had designed 3 years ago, a couple who seemed perfect, whose love story had been easy to translate into space and light, whose ceremony had made everyone cry. They divorced 8 months later. I sat in my apartment for an entire evening, she said, questioning everything I believed about love, about whether I could actually see what I thought I saw, about whether any of it was real. He was quiet for a moment. What did you conclude? He asked. She set down her fork, met his eyes. That love is not the problem, she said. Fear is the problem. People stop before they get anywhere real, because the vulnerability required is too much, because retreating feels safer than risking. His expression shifted. Something moved beneath the surface of his careful composure. Yes, he said slowly. It does feel safer. His eyes held hers. She looked away first. Later, walking to her car, they moved through the doorway at the same moment. Their arms brushed against each other in the narrow space. A contact so minor it should not have registered as anything. She felt it in her collarbone. She drove home thinking about windows, about thresholds, about the promise she had made to herself at 16, in the aftermath of her mother's heartbreak, never to organize her happiness around someone who had not chosen her. But she was also thinking about the way he had placed dinner in front of her without asking, the way he had noticed her exhaustion before she noticed it herself, the way he looked at her as if she was someone worth studying, worth knowing, worth remembering. She was thinking about him. She was thinking about him in a way that had nothing to do with professionalism and everything to do with the specific, terrifying feeling of being in a room with someone and feeling found. She pulled into her parking space and sat in her car and had another conversation with herself about all the reasons this was impossible. The conversation was losing. The storm arrived on a Thursday evening in the 6th week. It came fast, the way autumn storms do in this part of the world. The light went amber and heavy first. Then the clouds rolled in, thick and dark, and the rain began to hit the windows with a force that made the city below simply disappear. One moment 42 floors of view, the next grey, static where a skyline had been. The power flickered once, twice. Darkness. She heard him moving across the room. No, fumbling. No, searching, moving with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where everything was. He found candles in a drawer by memory, which meant he had lit candles in this room before alone, in other storms or other darknesses, which meant something about his life in this beautiful penthouse that she did not let herself finish thinking about. 4 small flames between them on the table. The room became a different room, smaller, warmer, the world outside erased by rain and darkness. Just the two of them held inside a circle of soft gold light, while the storm kept its loud and private conversation with the glass. She should have left. The power was out. The meeting could have been rescheduled. There were perfectly reasonable professional reasons to pack up her materials and wait for the elevator to start working again and go home. She stayed. The planning documents stopped mattering somewhere in the first hour. They pushed them aside by unspoken agreement and simply talked. He told her about loneliness. No, as complaint, not as bid for sympathy, but as landscape, something he had learned to navigate over years. The specific isolation that comes with success, with being wanted for what you can provide rather than who you are. I have stood in rooms full of hundreds of people, he said, and felt completely unmet by every single one of them. She understood. She told him about her mother briefly, carefully, just enough to explain the lesson she had learned, the wall she had built. I decided I would never organize myself around someone who had not chosen me first, she said. Never wait by windows. Never build my happiness on ground that might shift at any moment. He was quiet for a moment. That sounds like wisdom, he said finally, but it also sounds like a very well-constructed cage. She looked at him sharply. No one had ever named it that way before. Maybe, she said, but cages keep things out as well as in. What if the thing you are keeping out, he said slowly, is the thing you most want? She did not answer. She did not have an answer. They talked about what love requires, about the difference between standing on a threshold and actually stepping through, about the way some people spend their whole lives in the doorway of their own happiness, because the surrender required to enter fully is more than they can bring themselves to make. He listened to every word she said. No, politely, no. While composing his response, he listened the way someone listens when they are memorizing. His hand found hers on the table somewhere in the third hour. No, dramatically, no, with any announcement or acknowledgement. Just there, suddenly his palm settling over the back of her hand, warm, still, certain she looked at it. Then at him, Dominic, she said softly, carefully, as if his name was something fragile. I know, he said, that was all. He did not move his hand, neither did she. The candles burned down another inch. The rain kept its conversation with the glass. The city remained invisible somewhere below them, a world that had nothing to do with this room, this moment, this warmth spreading through her from the point where his skin touched hers. She sat in the quiet of that connection and felt something she had not felt in longer than she could remember. She felt found. She drove home at midnight, after the power returned and the rain softened and the world outside became visible again. She sat in her car in her parking space and pressed her forehead to the steering wheel. She had promised herself she would never wait by windows. She was already waiting. If your heart is somewhere between breathless and terrified right now, pause for 1 second. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think she is about to discover, what you think is really happening in this story, because we are walking right to the edge of it. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the moment. What comes next is going to change everything. It was a Tuesday. The 6th week was almost over. The wedding details were nearly finalized. The venue was confirmed. The flowers were ordered. The music was selected. The timeline was precise. Every element was in place for what would be, by every professional measure, one of the most beautiful intimate weddings she had ever designed. She should have felt satisfied. She usually felt satisfied at this stage of a project, when all the pieces came together and she could see the shape of what she had built. She felt something else entirely. He stepped out for a conference call. His voice shifted as he walked toward his study, dropping into its other register, controlled, authoritative. The sound of a man the rest of the world recognized as something formidable. She was alone in the main room. She was looking for a venue contract she had drafted that morning. Something about the lighting specifications that she wanted to confirm before the final walkthrough. She checked the drawer of the side table, where they usually kept working documents. Stuck. She pulled harder. It released too far, jerking open with a force that sent several folders sliding forward. One slipped over the edge, fell to the floor, opened as it landed. Papers spreading across the polished wood. She leaned down to collect them, already composing an apology in her mind for disorganizing his materials. And then she saw her name, her full name. Maren Elise Calloway, clean serif typeface, positioned exactly where a bride's name sits on a wedding invitation. The air left the room. She did not move for several seconds. She simply knelt there, one knee on the cold floor, staring at the paper in front of her, with the particular stillness of someone trying to process information that does not fit any existing category. Then she sat down fully, no dramatically. Her legs simply stopped working. She pulled the folder toward her with hands that were trembling, her measurements exact, on a gown specification sheet, numbers she recognized because she had been fitted for formal wear twice this year, and she knew her own body, a ring design, custom. She stared at the engraving specification printed along the inner band. Her birthday, month, day, year, a personal file. Pages of details that only someone who had been studying her closely, carefully, over an extended period, could possibly know. Her favorite flowers, white ranunculus, the perfume she wore. Something with notes of bergamot and cedar that she had been wearing for 7 years. The way she took her tea, strong with exactly 1 spoon of honey, no milk. The author she quoted when she was tired and honest. The phrase she used when something moved her. A specific gesture she made with her hands when she was thinking. She pressed the folder closed with both palms and sat in the silence of his penthouse. The candles from the storm were still in their holders on the table. The violin case she had noticed on the shelf in his study, but never asked about. The greenhouse visible through the window, glass walls catching the late afternoon light. And she felt the entire architecture of the past 6 weeks restructure itself around a single devastating truth. Every description of the bride. Quiet mornings over elaborate events, candle light over chandeliers, a woman who prefers authenticity to performance, a woman who makes particular distinctions, a woman who does not know how remarkable she is. He had been describing her to herself. Across 6 weeks of meetings and late evenings and charged silences, while she sat beside him and took notes and made recommendations for flowers and music and lighting. While she built, with her own hands, a wedding she thought belonged to someone else. Anger arrived first, clean, clarifying, legitimate. She had worked on this for 6 weeks without the information that made it make sense. She had disciplined feelings she might have handled differently if she had known. She had been manipulated, used, played in some elaborate game whose rules she did not understand. And then, underneath the anger, moving through it like current through deep water, the most dangerous feeling of all. The feeling of being seen, no glanced at, no admired from a convenient distance, seen with specificity and seriousness and a patience that no one had ever brought to the task of knowing her. Someone had been paying attention, real attention, the kind that noticed what perfume she wore, and how she took her tea and what phrases she used when something moved her. Someone had been studying her like she was worth studying. Someone had been building toward her with the same careful, patient attention she brought to building weddings for other people, which was the most infuriating thing she had ever felt. And she felt it completely. She stood up, smoothed her jacket, straightened her posture into the armor she had been wearing since she was 16 years old, and she walked out of the room to find him. He was in the greenhouse. She saw him through the glass walls as she approached, standing among the orchids with his back to the entrance, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders carrying a tension she could see even from 20 feet away. She opened the door, stepped inside, let it fall closed behind her. He turned before she reached him, as if he had been waiting for this moment longer than today, as if some part of him had known, from the instant he walked out for that conference call, that the architecture was finally going to collapse. His eyes dropped to the folder in her hand, rose slowly to her face, and she saw something she had never seen in him before. Fear, real fear, unguarded, unmanaged, the kind of fear that lives beneath all the armor and composure and carefully constructed control. The kind of fear that only exists when something matters. Who is the bride? No, a question. Her voice was level in the specific way voices go level when the only alternative is complete collapse. He put his hands in his pockets. She understood why. He was keeping them from shaking. You, he said, soft as confession, soft as something that had been held for a very long time and was finally, carefully being set down. Everything, she heard her own voice from a distance. Right now, do not calculate it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke. I met you 14 months ago, he said, at the Whitmore auction. You were fixing flowers that no one had asked you to fix, and you spoke to me like I was a person instead of a headline. He paused. I drove home that night and sat in my car for 11 minutes and could not move. Because I had never felt anything like that, because I had no infrastructure for it. His jaw tightened, and every way I had of approaching you felt wrong, like acquisition, like leverage. You had already shown me in 20 minutes that you were not interested in being acquired, that you saw through the performance of wealth. He looked at her with an expression that was completely open, completely undefended, And underneath all of that was the fear that if I came to you as just a man, nothing else, no empire, no position, nothing except who I actually am, it might not be enough. The rain had started again, soft against the greenhouse glass. The orchids nodded gently in the climate-controlled air. So you built a wedding, she said. I built a reason for you to stay long enough to know me, he said. I wanted to show you my intention in a language you understood. I wanted to demonstrate that I had paid attention, that I saw you. He paused. I was not trying to manipulate you, he said. I was trying to court you. The only way I could think of that would not feel like an ambush. She looked at him for a long time. She felt the betrayal. Clearly, legitimately, she had been working for 6 weeks without understanding what she was building. She had been disciplining feelings she might have explored if she had known they were mutual. She had been kept in the dark while he constructed something around her, but she also felt something else. She felt the weight of what he was describing, the fear of not being enough, the terror of offering your actual self to another person and being rejected. She had felt that fear too. She had built her entire adult life around avoiding it. And here was a man who had felt the same fear, and instead of retreating into his empire and his armor and his carefully constructed safety, he had tried, imperfectly, elaborately, with complete and unmistakable sincerity. He had tried to reach her in the only way he knew how. I need time, she said quietly. He nodded. His hands were still in his pockets. She could see the tension in his forearms, the effort of keeping them still. Take whatever you need, he said. I am not going anywhere. She left without looking back, because if she looked back, she would stay, and she was not ready yet. She did not sleep. She sat in her apartment with tea that went cold and then colder. She sat in the dark because she did not want to turn on lights. She sat with the folder of documents she had taken from his penthouse spread across her kitchen table, and she went through all of it. Every meeting, every evening, every moment she had filed away and refused to examine. She went through it now with new eyes, and it clarified. Like a photograph resolving from blur into focus, every detail sharpening, every moment finding its meaning, the dinner he had placed in front of her without asking. No, a client being polite, a man taking care of someone he loved, the chair he had pulled close. No professional courtesy, the need to be near her, the hand on the back of her chair for 45 minutes. No, touching but present, restraint as a form of respect, the thumb moving across her knuckle, want carefully controlled, his breathing in that moment at the elevator, a man exercising significant self-discipline, restraint across 6 weeks as a form of giving her space, as a form of letting her choose without pressure. She thought about her mother, about windows, about organizing a life around someone who had not chosen you first, but he had chosen her first, before she knew she was in the room, before she knew the wedding was hers, before she knew anything at all. He had chosen her 14 months ago, and he had spent all the time since then trying to find a way to reach her that would not feel like intrusion. She pressed her palms against her eyes. She sat in the grey early light and felt the wall she had built at 16, carefully, necessarily, brick by careful brick. She felt it develop a crack, so deep and so specific that she understood, with complete clarity, that it was not going to hold. The letter arrived under her door before sunrise. No envelope. Just folded paper slid through quietly. She would later learn that he had driven across the city in the dark to deliver it himself, because he did not trust anyone else to carry words this important. The handwriting was controlled in the way of a man who had trained himself to be controlled, but there were places where the pen had pressed harder, where the letters leaned forward, where the discipline thinned and something true showed through the gap. She sat on her floor, her back against the door, and she read it. I am not writing this to change your answer. I am writing it because you asked for truth, and I gave you facts, which are not the same thing. The truth is that I have never been afraid of anything the way I am afraid of losing the possibility of you. The truth is that the night of the storm, when the lights went out and we talked for 3 hours, I felt more known than I have felt in years. And it had nothing to do with money or position, or any of the things I used to feel certain about in the world. The truth is that my hands were shaking when I brought you dinner that night. I did not want you to see. The truth is that they are shaking now. If you walk away, I will accept it. You have every right. I should have told you sooner. I was afraid, and I let the fear make decisions for me, and I am sorry. But you asked for truth, and this is it without architecture around it, for whatever it is worth to you. She read it once, she read it again. She sat with it in the pale gold of early morning, while the city outside her window slowly woke. Delivery trucks, early commuters, the sounds of a world that had no idea two people were standing at the edge of something. She thought about a man who tended orchids at dawn, who kept his grandmother's love letters in a wooden box, who played violin badly alone at night because no one had taught him, but he wanted to learn anyway. She thought about how he had placed dinner in front of her without making it into anything, how he had pulled the chair close and stood behind it for 45 minutes without touching her, how he had paused at the elevator, restraining himself, giving her space. She thought about the letter in her hands, the handwriting that leaned forward in the places where the discipline ran out. She thought about windows, about thresholds, about the difference between standing at the door of your own happiness and actually stepping through. She put on her coat. He was in the greenhouse when she arrived, standing among the orchids, his back to the entrance, as if he could not bring himself to face the door while he waited for whatever came through it. He turned when he heard her footsteps on the gravel path, said nothing, gave her everything, the floor, the room, the outcome, without reservation, without preemption, without any attempt to influence what she might say. The way a man stands when he has decided that whatever happens next belongs entirely to someone else. She crossed the space between them, stopped close enough to see the evidence of a sleepless night in his eyes, the controlled stillness of a man who was not entirely controlled. "If I say yes," she said carefully, "it will be because I chose to. No, because I was arranged into a corner I could not see until I was already standing in it. No, because you built something around me that I did not understand." She held his gaze. "Because I chose, with everything I know and everything I feel, freely." Something released in him. Tension she understood now had been living in his chest for a very long time. Months, maybe longer. "It was always your choice," he said quietly. "I only built the table. Everything that happened at it," he paused, "was yours from the beginning." She stepped closer. "I am not saying yes because you planned this, I know," he said, barely above quiet. "I am saying yes," she said, "because you put dinner in front of me without asking, because you stood behind my chair for 45 minutes without touching me, because you wrote me a letter with shaking hands before the sun came up." She paused. "Because the night of the storm, you put your hand over mine, and all you said was, 'I know.' And that was the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years." She looked at him. "And because I have been losing arguments with myself about you since the 3rd week, and I am tired of losing." His hand came up slowly, curved around her face. His thumb traced her cheekbone once, with the particular care of someone handling something they have been quietly, privately terrified of losing. "Marin," he said, her name, her full name, kept carefully for exactly this moment. She leaned into his palm. "Let us finish planning the wedding," she whispered. His forehead came down to rest against hers. They stood like that for a long time. No kissing, no speaking, just breathing the same small, warm space of air between them, and she felt the thing that had been building across 6 weeks of charged silences and restrained touches and arguments she kept losing, finally, completely, arrive. The ceremony was 37 people in the greenhouse on a November evening. Early twilight, amber light filtering through the glass walls, orchids blooming in every direction, the specific, patient result of someone's careful attention over years. She had designed every detail herself, this time knowing, this time with the full weight of whose threshold she was building toward, whose life she was stepping into, whose name was engraved in the ring that had been waiting in a drawer while she chose flowers and fabrics and the precise quality of light for a wedding she thought belonged to someone else. The white ranunculus she had recommended for a woman who did not like performance, arranged in clusters along the aisle. The candlelight she had insisted on instead of chandeliers, warm and soft and honest. The intimate scale of it, witness instead of audience, exactly what she would have wanted if she had known she was planning her own wedding, Some part of her, she thought, had always known. He saw her from the far end of the glass corridor, and she saw his hands. Those steady empire-building hands that had navigated impossible negotiations without a visible tremor, that had built companies and closed deals, and held the weight of thousands of people's livelihoods. Shaking just slightly, just barely, a trembling so small that only someone who had been paying the specific quality of attention she had been paying would ever catch it. She smiled. She smiled before she reached him. When she arrived at his side, he looked at her the way a man looks at something he spent a long time being afraid he would never have. No triumph, the quiet of relief, of arrival, the extraordinary stillness of being exactly where you were always walking toward, even when you did not know it. Their vows were true things spoken quietly, amber light and 37 witnesses and orchids holding the ceremony in their patient, blooming presence. I choose you specifically and completely, he said. His voice was steady. His hands in hers were not quite. And I will keep choosing you past every version of myself that comes after this moment. She held his hands through every word. Their first kiss as husband and wife was slow. Serious, it tasted like the end of a very long-held breath. He pressed his forehead to hers immediately after, eyes closed, her name moving soundlessly on his lips. And 37 people went completely still, the way people go still when they understand they are not watching a performance. They are watching something real. Later, when the guests had gone, and the greenhouse had settled into quiet, and the last candles had burned down to warm, soft nothing, she lay with her back against his chest in the window seat, surrounded by flowers she had recommended months ago for a bride she had not yet known was herself. She traced the lines of his hand where it rested over hers, the knuckles, the slight callus from years of tending things that grew, the specific warmth she understood now she had been aware of since the very first night. Outside, the city burned on, brilliant and distant and entirely uninvited up here. You were always the only bride, he said softly. No, a declaration for a room, a fact spoken in the quiet, for her alone. I know, she said. A beat of silence. Were you afraid today, she asked, when you saw me walking toward you? Profoundly, he said. She smiled. Your hands were shaking. They were, he said, without embarrassment. Without apology, they have been shaking since the night I sat in my car for 11 minutes and understood what had happened to me. She turned slightly, looked at him in the dim, warm light, this man who had built greenhouses and kept letters and constructed an elaborate, imperfect, deeply sincere bridge across the distance his own fear had made. She pressed her lips to the corner of his jaw, once gently, without urgency. His arm tightened around her, like a question finally answered. The candle on the window-sill burned low, and the rain returned, soft and unhurried, its old conversation with the glass resuming, as if it had simply paused to let them catch up. I have one question for you before you go, and I need your honest answer. When she found that folder, when she saw her own name on the invitation, her measurements on the gown, her birthday engraved in a ring he had already commissioned while she was building a wedding she thought belonged to someone else, would you have walked out and never looked back, or would you have stood in that doorway, demanded the truth, and stayed to hear it? Was what Dominic did romantic, or was it a beautiful kind of wrong? And tell me honestly, at which moment did you feel it? The dinner he placed in front of her without asking, the hand on the back of her chair for 45 minutes, not touching, just there, the letter arriving under her door before the sun came up, the handwriting leaning in the places where discipline ran out. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. This community deserves this conversation. And if this story found something real in you tonight, if it gave you that quiet particular ache of something that matters, please subscribe to this channel right now. Like this video. Share it tonight with one person who needs to believe that love sometimes finds its way to you, even when you have stopped looking for it and started building it for everyone else instead. Because the next story is already waiting, and I think it will reach somewhere even deeper than this one.